Rome always had slavery, and it just became more and more common as Rome began to conquer more and more territories. So Rome eventually was made up almost 2/3 of its population, well, between one third and 2/3 of its population being slaves, and the rest being free. So these slaves would often resent their slavery and rise up and break out in rebellions against the Roman domination. One slave rebellion was led by a very famous slave called Spartacus, and he and his fellow slaves rose up and fought and were successful in fighting some of the Roman legions for quite a long time. And they roamed around the Italian countryside looking for a way of escape to another part of Europe, probably. However, eventually Spartacus was defeated by the Roman troops. But it just showed the weakness of the Roman system, where there were so many slaves and not enough that were free men. Originally, Roman legions were made up of free citizens of Rome, and no non-citizen would have been allowed to be one of the legions. However, as time goes on and men are killed in battle or grow old or retire, they are forced, the Romans were forced to accept non-citizens in their troops, and even oftentimes the reward for fighting in battle or fighting in the legion was citizenship at the end of your military career. And usually a military career was about between 20 or 30 years. So a man would join the legion as possibly in his late teens and work his way through the ranks and look forward to retiring with the reward of citizenship and possibly even land. So those were the things that he was looking forward to. But the thing that was very weakening to the Roman system was that these legions became paid rather than volunteer. And as a paid legion, you were looking to the person who was paying your salary as the person you actually obeyed. And so many of these salaries were paid by generals, rich Roman citizens who had gathered these men together and had trained them to use for their own purposes, to win glory for the general in battle, usually in foreign countries, but sometimes used even within the Italian peninsula against other Romans. So this is where the tension begins to mount, because generals would often compete with one another for who was the more glorious or who was had the more battle successes. And so two of these generals eventually become Caesar and Pompey. These two generals fight for glory between them, and eventually Pompey is the loser. In 58 BC, Julius Caesar led his army into Gaul, which is this area here. And Gaul was a crazy and wild place. It was the Wild West, literally, for the Italians. The people of Gaul were Celtic at this point, and they would paint themselves bright blue and go into battle naked and do all kinds of crazy things. And the Romans thought of these barbarians as crazy, emotional, and formidable fighters. But Julius Caesar proved himself to be a brilliant military leader. His success threatened other generals, especially Pompey. The Senate ordered him to disband his army because they were afraid that he was becoming too successful and that he would try to gain political power in Rome, which is exactly what he was wanting to do. Instead of disbanding his army and coming humbly back to Rome, he turned his army around and marched from Gaul all the way through the Alps and down into the Italian peninsula. There's a very, very, very small river that is right above Rome, and well, we don't even know where it is today, but this was a famous river in ancient Rome, and it was called the Rubicon. And today you'll sometimes hear a phrase called to cross the Rubicon, and this means to reach a point where there is no return. And this is true for Caesar. When he made that critical decision of taking his troops across the Rubicon, he realized there was no turning back. He was committing treason, he was going against the Senate's orders, and he was taking power for himself. Caesar crushed his rival Pompey, who used other Roman troops to go out and try to stop Caesar from coming. And eventually Pompey ran from the battlefield and ran away to North Africa eventually, and trying to get away from Caesar. Caesar became absolute ruler of Rome in 48 BC, and he ruled for 4 years. Caesar realized that Rome was in very serious trouble. It thought of itself as a republic, but in fact it was an empire, although it was still functioning on republican principles, and it was failing at that. There was a lot of poverty, there was social unrest, there was a lot of joblessness and hopelessness. And so Caesar came in, and he had some really good ideas. First, he started a public works project that gave jobs to these jobless farmers who had come in from the fields that had been displaced from the creation of latifundia. And he also granted citizenship to a lot of the conquered peoples who had been incorporated into the Roman Republic, which was actually an empire. He also saw that there was a lot of problems with the calendar system that the Romans had been using. And he had himself visited the metropolitan city of Alexandria, where there were many scholars, and he had seen that there was a better calendar system, and so he adopted that calendar system for the Romans, and this became known as the Julian calendar. And many of the days of many of the months in the calendar were named after the gods and goddesses of Rome. "Beware the Ides of March," wailed Caesar's wife to him as he left Chipperley that morning. But he took no notice of his wife's theatrical, emotional breakdown, because she was apparently known for that. And instead, he went to the Senate, expecting a normal day, when he was surprised by an attack. The senators stabbed him, each one stabbing him, so that each one was guilty, so that none of them would accuse the other of a crime that they had all committed together. So March of 44 BC, Caesar was killed. Caesar had been accused of trying to become the king of Rome, which was the ultimate crime in the Roman Republic. To become king was to revert back to the old times before the Roman Republic. And so the senators felt like they were doing a service to humanity by taking care of this terrible tyrant. Instead, it opened the way for the Roman Republic to transform itself into the Roman Empire, where they would have men who became more than a king. They became emperors. So the first, what we would consider first emperor of Rome, was a man named Octavian, who got renamed Augustus. And Octavian, or Caesar Augustus, was the nephew of Caesar. Caesar is actually the last name. It was Julius, who would be his first name, and Octavian was the first name of the next ruler. So Octavian Caesar became the next ruler of Rome, and he legislated all of these things that changed Rome to become a